All right, let's continue. Look at the first unalienable right that they usually mention. Life. Why would you say that? Because it comes from God and nowhere else. Humans will never invent life. It's not going to happen. And look at the passages. The Bible's loaded with it. So God is the source of human life. He gives it, He grants it, and He regulates it. It's His right to tell us under what conditions your life could be terminated. And the government should not interfere with that. Look at some of these passages on Mars Hill. Paul said He gives to all life, breath, and told those pagans. You know where life comes from? Not Apollo or Zeus. It comes from the God of the Bible who gives breath, life to all things. Which, by the way, would be one of the reasons why abortion's wrong. That's why they have to shroud it. Well, it's just a blob of cells. Well, we're all that. We're not talking about the body. We're talking about the person. All of us are different in that we have a different being, a different person, a spirit within us. That comes from God. Your body came from your parents when their genetic material joined. Boom, there's your physical body. But where'd your spirit come from? That didn't come from your parents. That was infused at the moment your physical body came into existence by God Himself. And it will be here it will exist forever. Your body will deteriorate and die, not your spirit. That will enter on into the eternal realm forever and ever. 1973 U.S. Supreme Court, God help them, they're going to give account. Some of them already are, aren't they? They facilitated a bloodbath slaughter that I suspect is unparalleled in human history. The worst regimes, the worst dictators have not done what we've done in this country. The God you read about in the Bible, I do not believe He's going to let that go. I can't believe that. Number 2, liberty, freedom. God gave freedom? Yeah, created you in such a way that you have that. What are we talking about? Do whatever I want to do? Well, He's given you laws that ought to govern your use of your freedom. But you do have the right to make your own decisions, control your own actions, exercise your own will, change your circumstances, move wherever you want to move. You know, that's not the case in a lot of countries. The more socialism and communism have taken over a country, the more they control and restrict the people. Now that's fact. And they interfere into people's freedom that God doesn't want them to interfere with. You know, there are countries that will decide what profession you're going to pursue. They'll give you tests and stuff. Okay, you're going to be a carpenter and you're going to do this and you're going to do that. Americans just can't fathom that. That's not right. You have a right to decide what profession you want to pursue. And we're just so used to that, we don't think anything about it. But that's really rare in human history. But it came from God. Remember how Joshua put it? If it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose whom you're going to serve. That's your right to make that choice. And you'll have to live with the consequences. Remember, Paul said, if I do this willingly, I have a reward. If against my will, not so much. Whoever desires, let him take the water of life freely. See, this is all part of the very nature of what it means to be a human being that God created. He created you a free will agent. You decide your eternal destiny and everything in between. That's one reason why kidnapping, you would think, why would that be a capital crime? Because they would be interfering with the freedom of that person to decide, you know, where they want to be and so forth. Somebody kidnaps you and takes you against your will elsewhere, they are infringing upon a natural right, an unalienable right that God Himself gave you. How dare they interfere with that? That's serious to God. It's so serious, it's a death penalty offense. How about that? John Adams said in 1765, liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it, derived from our Maker. If we had not, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. He's going back in British history there a little bit to refer to that. Samuel Adams, the right to freedom is the gift of Almighty God. The rights of the colonists as Christians, look at this. See, they don't put any of these quotes in public school because they contradict everything they propagated. May be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian church, which are to be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament. That's where the rights, our rights come from. They come from God, and they're stipulated in Scripture. Notice, in creating humans in His own image, God bestowed on them free will, volition, the right to free. God told Adam and Eve, you can do this, you can do this, you can't do this. But it's your choice. God steps back and allows us to decide our eternal future. It's the very nature of the situation, the nature of us. So liberty, the freedom, is the right to decide for yourself how you are going to live. And God has accompanied that with laws, as He wants countries to have laws that deal with people who exercise their freedom in such a way that it is illicit behavior. And God has to tell you what that is. Life and liberty. Number 3, pursuit of happiness. The right to pursue one's own advantage and enjoyment within moral limits, including selection of vocation, profession, trade, a business. Look at some of these passages. Then you shall return to the land of your possession, and look at God telling us this. Enjoy it. God wants you to enjoy life. He absolutely does. Every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God. God who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Well, notice, that's not the government's job to do that for you. You have a right in God's sight to pursue your own happiness as defined by God, but it's up to you to pursue it. When our civilization begins granting people, giving people, taking taxpayer money and getting for people things that they may well have a right to acquire for themselves, but they are responsible for doing that, then the government has shifted into an illicit role that is in fact contrary to the will of God. The next unalienable right, private property acquired by one's own lawful moral labor. Over and over and over the Bible tells us we have to work for that, but you have a right to work and acquire it. You remember when Ananias and Sapphira decided to sell a piece of their own property. And then the husband comes, right, and gives almost all of it. We don't know how much he kept back. No problem there. But then he lied about it. And look at what the inspired Peter said. While that land was in your possession, was it not yours? It's a rhetorical question. That was yours. You can do what you want with it. And even after you sold it, you didn't have to bring the money. That money's yours. Do what you want with it. It's your choice. God gives you that right. That's an unalienable right to your property. Well, their problem was that they lied about it. How'd you like to be a member of that congregation? Probably came out in the newspaper the next morning. 2 people struck dead at that church. Who'd want to place membership there? But God did that. Remember the result? Fear came upon people. It needed to. Let him who stole, Paul said, steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good. There's a lost concept in our culture. That he may not only have his own needs met, but have something to give to others. See, all of this is God's mind working itself out for human behavior. It all makes perfect sense. It's astounding. Even the 10 Commandments, don't steal and don't covet, recognize property rights. God wants those recognized. Government doesn't have a right to interfere with that. Matthew 20. Remember the 11th hour workers, and the master said, hey, I'm going to pay these guys that showed up at the 11th hour just as much as I'm going to pay the guys that have been here all day and borne the heat of the day. And that upset them. Well, that's not fair. What do you mean it's not fair? I'm not doing you any wrong. Didn't you agree to work for a denarius? Take what's yours. Notice that. Property transfer there. You've earned that. You have a right to receive it. Go your way. I wish to give to this last man the same as you. Is it not lawful for me to do what I wish with my own? There is the biblical and American concept of the right, the unalienable right to property, articulated right there in the Bible. The founders didn't make this up. They got it from God's thinking. They believed ownership of land. By the way, that was one of their big problems with the monarchy. They owned all the land in England. You go over there and kill a deer. Did you ever see Robin Hood with Errol Flynn? You kill a deer on, the government property, they'll put you to death for it. That's not right. The whole notion of allowing people to acquire property, including actual land, is a biblical concept. What if when Noah stepped off the ark, he had said, okay, there's only 8 of us here. We own the whole planet. It's our land. They didn't have a right to do that. Implied, you see, is what you actually have the ability to acquire and use and maintain. So when I'm getting into something that I told you is in the book, if you want to look at it. It's in an appendix at the back. You won't even notice it. According to God, when the Europeans came to this country and found indigenous groups scattered around, who, by the way, did not believe you could own the land. You can't watch anything on TV about Indians where they don't come out and say, it even started in the 50s on Wagon Train. Oh, we're taking their land away from them. They didn't believe that. Certainly not the ones that were on the East Coast that are pretty much all gone now. They believed you can no more own the land than you can the air or the water in the stream. So what do you mean we took their land? That's a false concept to begin with. But for somebody to just come in and say, okay, this is all ours, you don't have a right to do that. So those things have to be decided by the people involved in that. Well, God was indicating that now you're to spread out across the planet, and as you go, you will be able to acquire property. But that doesn't mean just because you say you own all this, you do. Well, go back and study that. They believed this was a critical personal right given by God. The government nor nobility were to monopolize its ownership. Throughout history, kings, dictators, governments have exercised complete authority over the private property of citizens. I heard a few years ago that our brethren had gone to China and built a children's home, and the government just took it. They just have the right to come in and take your property and take your building. And what are you going to do about it? Well, that's a violation of natural rights, and God's not pleased with that. So any government, any country that does that kind of stuff, they're violating the Bible. And Americans have generally been exempt from that. 1 Corinthians 9, do we not have a right to eat and drink? Look at that, that's a right. God created your body, right? He created it where you have to have nourishment. You have to take it. Well, then you're not only authorized to do that, that's a right that you have. You have the right to breathe air. I'm surprised the government hadn't, well, they've done a lot about our air, but surprised they haven't rationed us on that or something. Okay, you can only breathe in this much today. Do we have a right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles, the brothers of the Lord, Cephas? Is it only Barnabas and I who have a right to refrain from working? Whoever goes to war, his point here is not, oh yeah, I don't have to work. Oh no, you have to work. There's not anybody on the planet that owes you a living. How many of you remember your parents or grandparents saying that? You don't ever hear that now. All kinds of people owe me. Nope. Nobody ever goes to war at his own expense. Soldiers have to be supported to do that. You plant a vineyard, you don't eat of the fruit unless you take care of it. What about a flock? Don't you drink of the milk of the flock? See, these are fundamental principles that show the rights of human beings. Look at under the law of Moses, don't muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Let him eat from his work. If you're even going to let a dumb animal be fed from the food that he's helping you to acquire, then is it not the case that humans are to benefit from their labor? So these verses press these principles so clearly. Private property, you have a right to acquire it, but you have to work for it. You know, the mentality of the welfare system and a lot of this stuff that politicians are doing, not out of compassion. Come on. Not out of compassion. It's out of political interest. But they would think, you know, oh, I have a right to an automobile. No, you don't. People are so confused in their thinking about all of that. Less and less responsibility taken for human behavior. Even to the point, as you know, that our courts for 50 years now have been saying, oh, well, he killed that person, but, you know, he was spanked when he was a child, and so it's really not his fault. So you're exempting, if there's one thing that God does, he holds human beings accountable for their own actions. That's what the whole Bible's based on, and that's what hell and heaven are about. And it's hard to believe that we could reach a point where it's a kind of a spiritual insanity that has gripped our nation by its spiritual throats. Look at the inalienable rights that are involved in family relations. But near as I can tell, basically God authorizes every human being to have at least one marriage. You don't have to marry, but you are authorized to marry at least once. And then he goes ahead and stipulates under what conditions you could theoretically be married a second time, right? The death of the first spouse or the unfaithfulness of that spouse. And even then, look how narrow that is. That has to be the reason that you divorce that person, put them away, for that reason, not for some other reason. I've actually had people come to me and say, you know, we just couldn't get along. And so I waited until he or she committed fornication. Then, But they've already admitted in their mind, I don't want to be married to this person, and I'm going to divorce them. And then try to conjure up the correct reason to do so. Well, God knows what you're thinking, doesn't he? He's going to hold us accountable for our true motivations. Very narrow stipulation. And look at how, you know, under certain circumstances, a woman may not be able to bear children or whatever, but that doesn't interfere with the fact that God has given the right to adults, to married people, to bear their children, to rear them, to educate them, to take responsibility. There are automatic responsibilities that accompany the exercise of that divine right. But it all comes from God. Look at the passages. Ephesians 6, bring them up in the training and admonition of the Lord. And look at children have certain responsibilities along that line too. This founding father said it's the duty of parents to maintain their children decently according to their circumstances, protect them according to the dictates of prudence, educate them according to the suggestions of a judicious and zealous regard for their usefulness, their respectability and happiness. Look what Blackstone said on this. These old fellows discussed all of this. The duty of parents to provide for the maintenance of their children is a principle of natural law, and obligation, says Pufendorf, he was another legal mind at the time, laid on them not only by nature herself, but by their own proper act in bringing them into the world. So now we don't want to bring them into the world, so we kill them before we do that. This has become so cockeyed. They would be in the highest manner injurious to their issue if they only gave their children life, that they might afterwards see them perish. By begetting them, therefore, they have entered into a voluntary obligation to endeavor, as far as in them lies, that the life which they have bestowed shall be supported and preserved, and thus the children will have the perfect right of receiving maintenance from their parents. You know, Americans always thought that. During the Depression in the 1930s, you know, your kids may not have shoes. I think my parents told me that they got them once a year or something, a pair once a year. Well, so that's not the biblical definition of poverty. But the parents took care of them, saw that they were fed and educated. Everything was fine. Our country was flourishing, morally and spiritually. Single women who get pregnant to have children in order to receive more money from the government and then fail to be attentive to and rear them, that is moral depravity of the ultimate degree. You remember that German family that managed to flee Germany and come here because the state government of Germany wanted them to teach all this liberal stuff that now has taken over our country. They came here to get away from that. The government deported him. Typical of the times in which we live. How about the right to worship, an inalienable right? Pursue, and really what that means is the right to pursue the worship of the one true God. Nobody's authorized to worship a false deity. So the right to worship has to do with worshiping the God of the Bible and following the Christian religion. And as we mentioned earlier, that doesn't mean that you can come up with these behaviors and justify them under the guise of right to worship and freedom of religion when it's depraved and contrary to the will of God. See how this all fits together perfect. It all makes sense. Here are some passages. Give to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering. Come into his courts. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Remember under the law of Moses. Worship the Lord your God. Jesus added this to the Deuteronomy passage. Him only you shall serve. Isn't that interesting? Him only you shall serve. Isn't that parallel to Ephesians 5? Sing to the Lord and sing only. Not play an instrument. You don't have a right to do that. True worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. God is in fact seeking such to worship him. The right to worship extends to all religions as long as nothing is practiced that is immoral by Christian standards. So would the founders have been against Muslims coming to our country? No, as long as they did not engage in Christian immorality by Christian definition. So the Quran authorizes a man to have up to 4 wives at a time. It's actually much more liberal than that because a man can divorce his wife for any reason and get more women. Okay, if our civilization was still intact and our laws were still what they should be, our government would be pursuing prosecutions all over this country where Muslims are practicing polygamy, and I guarantee you they are. It's been documented. Just like they went after the Mormons in the late 1800s. They would have put a stop to it. Do you know that this is all documented? In fact, I have a Book of Mormon that actually tells me that this is what happened. Whenever the U.S. government came to them and said, number one, you're not going to become a state. They were a territory, as long as this polygamy is going on. And they said, we're going to go after you and prosecute you if you don't stop it. This is absolute truth. The Mormon Church received additional revelation from God telling them to cease the practice of plural marriages. That's history, it's fact. That doesn't seem to faze the guys and girls that come to my door. I don't understand it. So, you cannot engage in anything that is immoral by Christian standards or harmful to other citizens. You can't say, well, I belong to a religion that has as one of its major premises to overthrow the U.S. government. So you think the founders said, well, that's freedom of religion. Okay. That's ridiculous. Why are we having such trouble thinking clearly and logically? George Washington, in a letter to the United Baptists of Virginia, I have often expressed my sentiments that every man conducting himself as a good citizen and being accountable to God alone for his religious opinions. See, already built into this concept of freedom of religion is the one true God and the one true religion. That's where they were coming from. Ought to be protected in worshiping the deity according to the dictates of his own conscience. They were really trying to deal with the Protestantism that characterized our country. But see, to them, that's all Christianity. So the religious freedom we're talking about here is the Episcopalians, which is the American name for the Anglican Church, the Church of England, cannot oppress the Baptists and make them do what they want them to do. There was the religious freedom that contextually was being discussed and under consideration by the founders. This is among the choicest of their blessings and their rights. There was a reply to the Quakers because they were concerned about whether or not they would be able to practice their religion. And then look at this one. The biblical right, natural right, unalienable right to self-preservation. This is so relevant now, is it not, with all this gun stuff going on? You know, I didn't grow up with guns. My parents didn't have a gun. Living in Montgomery, I finally got a pistol. But that's not the point, whether you like them or not. It is clearly the case that in God's sight, people have a right to self-defense. And I'm telling you, the Bible's full of this. My dad in World War II chose not to bear arms, and he believed it was a biblical reason. And he worked in the medical corps in England when those boys were flown back across the channel, having gone on to Normandy. So he worked there as kind of a nurse type thing. But I finally sat down and studied this out, and I found out, man, this is all over the place in the Bible. And it's a misuse of Matthew 5 and so forth to say that turn the other cheek or something means you can't ever defend yourself, because there's too much of it in the Bible. Don't think we go into this in a lot of detail, but let's see what we do here before we eat lunch. The fifth and last auxiliary right of the subject that I shall at present mention is that of having arms for their defense, suitable to their condition and degree, and such as are allowed by law, and is indeed a public allowance under due restrictions of the natural right of resistance and self-preservation, which the sanctions of society and laws are found insufficient to restrain the violence of oppression. So you have a right to not be subjected to that. And if the government falls down and doesn't do its job, then it reverts back to your natural right as an individual on this planet within that society. The founders, in fact, believed that that's exactly what the Revolutionary War was. They said that. We didn't fire the first shot. We made multiple pleas for over a 10-year period to the king and parliament, begging them to stop interfering with our God-given rights that they had no right to interfere with. And so when push came to shove, they entered into a defensive posture in waging the Revolutionary War. Did you know that? I mean, they said this over and over. They put out a document that gave the actual rationale for bearing arms. That's not ever taught in school. And by the way, God's referred to several times in that document. They believed they were waging a defensive war. Look at what Joseph's story. He's one of the other fathers of jurisprudence. Here's the great legal minds that were part of the formation of the legal system of our country. The right of citizens to keep and bear arms has justly been considered as the palladium of the liberties of a republic. That's defined as something that affords effectual protection or security. You don't want to give this up. Since it offers strong moral check against the usurpation and arbitrary power of rulers. Boy, this is starting to sound more familiar to us. See, we used to think, oh, you're talking about people like Hitler and the communists and Saddam Hussein, and it sounded more and more like people we could name this morning right here in our own country. And will generally, even if these are successful in the first instance, enable the people to resist and triumph over them. Here was a case in Kentucky. The right of necessary defense in the protection of a man's property, a man's person or property, is derived to him from the law of nature and should never be unnecessarily restrained by municipal religion. Talks about to protect the robber, the burglar, the nocturnal thief by an unnecessary restraint of the honest citizen's natural right of self-defense. Sir Matthew Hale. The right of self-defense in these cases is founded in the law of nature and is not nor can be superseded by the law of society. Politicians don't have a right to make laws that remove from human beings the right of self-defense. See, this is a biblical matter, not a political matter, a social matter. This is from God. If you have the right to defend yourself, then you have a right to do that. And making all the gun laws in the world is not going to change that. And it's ridiculous and absurd. There has to be an ulterior motive. Does there not? You do remember that Cain killed his brother with an AKA, repeating rifle. If you took everything away from humans, all the guns in this country, do you think murder would cease? I'm surprised the liberal element hasn't made a law that you can't have rocks in your possession, because you might hit somebody with one of those. And by the way, if they ever make that law, I want them to come to my yard first. Human beings have been killing each other for 6,000 years, and it doesn't have anything to do with guns. So I'm convinced there is an ulterior motive here. And we have history to back it up, because every communistic, Marxist, socialist effort to control a nation eliminates the guns. Now they do. That's just history. Go look at it and see. You must disarm the people in order to control them. The founders knew this. They had already witnessed it by their time. Look at this Supreme Court case. This goes back, this is actually a 2008 case. So there is a vocal element in our country that clamors for gun control and or complete ban on guns. Look at this. This senator unveiled her bill. This is, what's the date? A few years ago, not long, to limit semi-automatic weapons, 2013, looks like. When Obama was our president, and these horrible situations occur where kids kill a bunch of other kids or whatever. And so, man, they want to do everything they can, they claim. He signed 23 executive orders and proposed 12 congressional actions regarding gun control 1 month after that particular shooting. Proposals for increased gun control, universal background checks on firearms, purchases and assault weapons ban, limiting magazine capacity to 10 cartridges. He formed a gun violence task force led by, at that time, Vice President to address the causes of gun violence in the United States, and 2 of the senators called for an assault weapon ban. If the men who established our country were here today, they would be outraged at such misguided foolishness and deeply concerned for the freedom that they provided at such great cost. Look at what the father of American Revolution said. Constitution be never construed to authorize Congress to infringe the just liberty of the press or the rights of conscience, or to prevent the people of the U.S. who are peaceable citizens from keeping their own arms or raising standing armies unless necessary for the defense of the country. They would be opposed to this, and they would be so, how could we ever come to this kind of thinking? Look at what James Madison said. The ultimate authority resides in the people alone. The advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation. If you were to live in China, the only way you could own a gun is if you went through a rigorous screening process, and even then, only under certain conditions. So as you know, murder has ceased in China. Nobody ever dies there from guns. Here is a case where these fellows attacked on a China train and killed 29 people and injured over 130. How could that happen with no guns? Well, they used knives. Okay, so people that think by banning guns, their thinking is skewed. Well, we'll add knives to it. You're not thinking. You're not thinking. Here's a young man. This was in Vista, California. He went on a rampage near Santa Barbara University, stabbed 3 people to death at his apartment before shooting to death 3 more. 13 people were injured, 8 from gunshot wounds, 4 from being hit by his car. He used his car as a weapon too, so we need to get rid of all the cars. Same rationale, isn't it? I'm not trying to make fun or anything. I'm just trying to reason this thing through. Liberal politicians who decry guns in the possession of citizens accept Secret Service protection by agents. You know, error is always self-contradictory. Always. It's hypocritical. This was at Ohio State. Remember that fellow that drove his car into a crowd before jumping out and cutting and stabbing people with a butcher knife? Ohio State is a gun-free zone, so he obeyed the law. A campus security guard opened fire, killing the would-be murderer. Gun control is like trying to reduce drunk driving by making it tougher for sober people to own cars. And that is so true. Here was Cesare Beccaria, who was an Italian legal mind praised by Thomas Jefferson. The laws of this nature, meaning taking the guns away from the people, are those which forbid to wear arms, disarming those only who are not disposed to commit the crime which the law means to prevent. How many hunters do you see going around killing people all over the country when they just like to go hunting every season? Can it be supposed that those who have the courage to violate the most sacred laws of humanity and the most important of the code will respect the less considerable and arbitrary injunctions, the violation of which is so easy and of so little? You understand what he's saying? The criminal doesn't care about you making a law against guns. That's not going to stop him from using a gun. Does not the execution of this law deprive the subject of that personal liberty so dear to mankind and to the wise legislator? And does it not subject the innocent to all the disagreeable circumstances that should only fall on the guilty? It certainly makes the situation of the assaulted worse and of the assailants better, and rather encourages than prevents murder, as it requires less courage to attack unarmed people than armed. Now that's sensible, sane thinking. And he uttered this way back in the 18th century. Unbelievable. Again, if you presented all this logical reasoning to those elements in our political arena, they're not going to sit there and say, oh, yeah, that is logical. I didn't think of that. That's not what's going on here. And they'll continue to live behind cloistered walls with armed guards. This isn't about that. It's not about guns. It's about disarming people for whatever purposes they intend. And they've become more vocal about that. I don't have to just, well, I think, and accuse them falsely. They are openly Marxist and socialist. They've said they are. And we are foolish if we ignore what history tells us about that group of people. So this is not only a violation of American rights, it's a violation of biblical rights as well. By the way, prison is a completely controlled environment, isn't it? Nobody's allowed to take guns in there. And by the way, they don't ever have them. I've never heard of anybody in prison being killed by one prisoner having a gun and the other one not. So you would think this is the perfect environment for liberal thinking. But you well know that inmates kill each other. That's not an uncommon thing. The only proper solution is to return Christian principles and Christian morality to the public square. You know, we would do far better with our civilization to flood our prisons with Bibles and Bible teachers. Our money would be far better spent. But of course, that sounds as bizarre as anything, doesn't it? There's no way they would even think about that. All right, let's move to the Bible very quickly. You want to stop at 15 till? Maybe this would be a good time for us to wait. So I've showed you what the founders say. But what does the Bible say about this? Again, I'm just astounded. When you actually go back and look at it, I'm astounded. But this would be a good time, I think, for us to pause and have our lunch, and then, Lord willing, we'll pick right up.